Caleb Harrow signed the papers with shaking hands. 23 years of his life, his sweat, his blood, all of it gone for the price of a single dollar. He watched the banker slide the crisp bill across the polished mahogany, a worthless token for a kingdom of grass and cattle. Outside, the world was ending. His world, anyway. He could hear his herd, confused and bellowing, as strangers with hard faces pushed them up loading ramps. That sound was worse than a gunshot. It was the sound of his own heart being ripped out. But the contract was ironclad. Vernon Blackwell, a man who smiled with his teeth but never his eyes, had made sure of that. The banker, a twitchy man named Silas, wouldn't look at him. He just kept shuffling papers, his gaze fixed on the inkwell. "Strange thing," Silas muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "Never seen a man sell prime land for a dollar. Not unless—" He bit his lip, cutting the sentence short. Not unless what? The question screamed in Caleb's mind, but his throat was a desert. He knew Silas knew something. Everyone in this dusty town knew something they weren't saying. They'd been looking through him for weeks, ever since Vernon's lawyers, smelling of city soap and corruption, had first darkened his doorstep. Caleb took the $1 receipt and folded it, the paper warm and flimsy against his calloused fingers. A legal sale. Everything above board. Nothing anyone could do. That's what the lawyers had said. He turned and walked toward the door, his boots echoing in the cathedral-like silence of the bank. The sound was hollow, the sound of an empty man. Behind him, he heard Silas pick up the telephone. The man's voice dropped, urgent and low. Caleb only caught a few words as the door swung shut. "It's done. Yes, just like you said. Tomorrow morning." Tomorrow morning. The words hung in the blistering midday sun. As Caleb's eyes adjusted to the glare, he saw them. Two riders on the high ridge overlooking the town. They'd been there every day for a week, as still as statues, just watching, waiting. He squinted, trying to make out details. The horses were painted, their flanks covered in symbols he didn't recognize. Apache. But that was impossible. There hadn't been Apache in these parts for a decade. The government had seen to that. Then one of the riders lifted his hand. It wasn't a wave. It was a signal, an acknowledgement. It was as if him signing those papers was the final piece of a puzzle they'd been waiting for him to place. A broken man who just lost everything. What in God's name could Apache warriors possibly want with him? The dust from the departing cattle wagon settled on Caleb's shoulders like a shroud. He walked the length of Main Street, each step a nail in the coffin of his old life. 23 years of fighting drought, rustlers, and disease, all of it reduced to a crumpled piece of paper in his pocket. He stopped in front of Murphy's General Store. Old Pete Murphy was out front, sweeping the porch with the same slow, deliberate strokes he'd used for 30 years. Pete was a rock, a man you could count on, but today the rock wouldn't meet his eyes. "Pete," Caleb said, his voice raspy. The broom stopped moving. "Heard about the sale," Pete mumbled, his words aimed at the dusty floorboards. "Shame. What happened?" "What exactly did happen, Pete?" Caleb pressed, a desperate edge to his voice. "Nobody's giving me a straight answer." Pete's knuckles went white on the broom handle. "Sometimes," he said, his voice dropping low, "a man signs papers he shouldn't. And sometimes those papers have words in them that weren't there the first time he read them." A shard of ice pierced Caleb's gut. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Vernon Blackwell's got lawyers who know tricks the devil himself would admire. Legal tricks." Pete finally looked up, and Caleb saw something in his eyes he'd never seen before. Fear. "That's all I'm saying, Caleb. I can't afford to say more." If Pete Murphy was scared, the whole world was tilted on its axis. Pete had faced down bandits and blizzards without flinching. Whatever Vernon had on this town, it was deep and it was dark. Caleb's gaze drifted back to the ridge. The two Apache riders were still there, patient as buzzards. In the clearer light, he realized he'd been wrong. The horses weren't painted for war. The markings were something else, more ceremonial. They weren't warriors waiting for a fight. They were messengers waiting for a meeting. "Pete, how long have those two been watching?" "About a week," Pete whispered, already backing toward the door of his store. "Every day, same time. They never come down. They just watch." A week, the exact same time Vernon's lawyers had appeared. The same time the bank had suddenly called in his loan, citing irregularities. The same time his whole life had begun to unravel like a cheap suit. It was all connected. It had to be. As he watched, one of the figures on the ridge dismounted. The man didn't get on his horse and ride away. He started walking, leading his horse down the steep incline with a steady, unhurried gait. He wasn't heading for the town. He was heading directly for Caleb. The Apache man moved with a quiet confidence, as if the ground itself rose to meet his feet. He was older, his face a roadmap of harsh sun and hard years, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. He stopped 10 feet from Caleb, a respectful distance. The entire street, which had been full of whispers and sideways glances moments before, was now utterly silent. Doors had been shut. Windows were empty. It was just the two of them under the vast, unforgiving sky. Pete Murphy's broom lay abandoned on his porch. "You are Caleb Harrow," the man said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. "I am," Caleb managed to say. "And you are?" "I am called Gray Eagle. I speak for my people." His English was perfect, cleaner than most of the men who drank at the local saloon. "We have been watching you, Caleb Harrow. We know what you buried on that land." The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. Buried? How could he possibly know? It was a secret Caleb had carried for 20 years, a secret he'd inherited from his father. A heavy, iron-bound chest filled with Spanish gold, a relic from a forgotten time, buried deep beneath the roots of an ancient oak tree. It was his fallback, his security, the one thing that was supposed to save him if everything else went wrong. But now everything had gone wrong, and this stranger knew his last desperate secret. "Why?" Caleb asked, his voice shaking. Gray Eagle gestured toward the distant hazy mountains. "My grandfather's grandfather hunted these lands. His bones rest in the sacred valley beyond the red cliffs." He paused, his dark eyes locking onto Caleb's. "We watched the settlers come. Most of them tore the land apart for quick profit. They treated the earth like something to be broken. But you were different. You restored the creek," Gray Eagle continued. "You left the old forest standing. You let the grass heal. You showed the land respect." "A lot of good it did me," Caleb said bitterly. "I lost it all anyway." "Did you?" Gray Eagle's voice held a strange, knowing tone. "Or did you simply lose what Vernon Blackwell wanted you to think you lost?" Another shockwave went through Caleb. "What do you know about Vernon?" "I know he uses the law like a weapon. I know he plans to strip this entire valley bare and leave it a wasteland." Gray Eagle took a step closer. "And I know the papers you signed today were not the same papers you read 3 weeks ago." Caleb's hands balled into fists. "Can you prove that?" "Perhaps." Gray Eagle reached into a leather pouch at his side and pulled out a folded document. It was crisp, official looking. "This is a copy of the original contract you agreed to. My people have ways of obtaining information that concerns our survival." With trembling hands, Caleb unfolded the paper. It was all there. The original loan terms, the payment schedule, the 60-day grace period for a missed payment. The papers he'd signed in the bank had given him 6 days. 6. They had swapped the documents. They had waited until he was cornered, then slipped a new contract in front of him, counting on his desperation and panic. It was fraud. Blatant, criminal fraud. "This proves it," Caleb whispered, a spark of hope igniting in the darkness. "But why are you helping me?" "Because your ranch is the only thing standing between Vernon Blackwell and our sacred valley," Gray Eagle said, his voice turning grim. "The government has already agreed to sell him the land where my ancestors are buried. The sale is finalized tomorrow morning." The final piece clicked into place. Vernon didn't just want Caleb's ranch. He wanted the access it provided. "Unless," Gray Eagle said, his eyes intense, "someone with legal standing as an adjacent landowner files an objection to the sale." "But I don't have legal standing anymore," Caleb said, the hope dying as quickly as it had appeared. "I don't own anything." Gray Eagle allowed himself a small, thin smile. "That depends entirely on whether those papers you signed today are legally binding." A new voice, slick and mocking, sliced through the air. A touching reunion, but entirely pointless. Both men spun around. Vernon Blackwell was strolling toward them, flanked by three of his hired guns. His expensive suit was a dark stain on the dusty street, and his smile was as cold as a tombstone. "Mr. Harrow," Vernon said, his voice dripping with false politeness. "Discussing ancient history with our local savages, are we?" Caleb clutched the contract in his hand. "This document proves you defrauded me, Vernon." Vernon laughed, a short, ugly sound. "That document is a forgery. And even if it weren't, who are you going to show it to? The judge who plays poker with me every Thursday? The sheriff who's in my pocket?" He nodded to one of his men, a big, ugly brute who took a menacing step forward. "Prove it," Vernon sneered. "Take me to court. Hire a lawyer with the dollar I so generously gave you. By the time you get a hearing, I'll have torn down every tree and dug up every bone in this valley." Gray Eagle stepped forward, his body shifting into a posture of readiness. Vernon's men mirrored him, their hands drifting toward their pistols. "Gentlemen, please," Vernon said smoothly. "The sale was legal. The documents were signed." He looked directly at Caleb, his eyes glittering with pure malice. "And tomorrow morning, I take possession of everything. Your ranch, the Apache lands, all of it." He turned to leave, then paused as if remembering something. "Oh, and that chest you have buried by the old oak tree. My men will be digging that up first thing. Consider it a bonus for my troubles." The world tilted under Caleb's feet. The gold. Vernon knew about the gold. How could he possibly know a secret only Caleb and his long-dead father shared? It wasn't just the land he was after. He was after everything. Vernon's smug laughter echoed down the street as he and his men walked away. Caleb was left standing in the dust, the fraudulent contract in his hand, feeling as useless as a feather in a hurricane. "He is more dangerous than you know," Gray Eagle said, his voice low and urgent. "This isn't just about land or gold." "What do you mean?" "3 days ago, my scouts saw his men in the Sacred Valley. They weren't surveying for a ranch. They were marking locations for mining." The word hung in the air. Mining. Of course, that explained the ruthless, single-minded pursuit. It was never about the cattle. "Silver?" Caleb asked. "The old stories speak of silver, yes," Gray Eagle said, his expression darkening. "But Vernon Blackwell is not a man who settles for old stories. He knows something more." The plan was monstrous in its simplicity. Use legal tricks to steal Caleb's ranch, which gave him the legal footing to buy the adjacent Sacred Valley from a corrupt government agent. Then, with both properties under his control, he could start mining, desecrating generations of Apache graves without anyone to stop him. "He plans to rip open our ancestors' graves for profit," Caleb said, the words tasting like poison. "And under the law, once he owns that land, he'll have the right to do it," Gray Eagle confirmed, "unless the adjacent landowner, you, files an objection before the sale is finalized at 10 o'clock tomorrow." "But I'm not the landowner," Caleb nearly shouted in frustration. "Vernon made sure of that." "The fraud changes that," Gray Eagle insisted. "If we can prove the sale was illegitimate before that deadline, your ownership is restored. Your objection would halt the sale of the Sacred Valley indefinitely." "How?" Caleb laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "With what lawyer? With what money? Vernon owns this town, body and soul. He probably owns the territorial judge, too." Gray Eagle fell silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "There is another way," he said finally, "but it requires a trust between our peoples that has not existed for 100 years. "I'm listening." "My people have kept records," Gray Eagle said, his voice barely a whisper. "Not just of our own history, but of yours. We have copies of the original government treaties, the first land grants, the territorial boundary maps." He leaned closer, his voice filled with an ancient power. "We have documents that show this entire valley, all of it, was never legally available for homesteading in the first place." Caleb stared, unable to process the words. "You're saying the government never had the right to sell this land? To anyone?" "I am saying," Gray Eagle said with grim certainty, "that every deed, every sale, every property line drawn in this valley for the last 50 years has been built on a lie, a legal fiction." The implication was staggering. If Gray Eagle presented those documents in court, it wouldn't just stop Vernon. It would invalidate everything. Every ranch, every farm, every home. It would wipe the entire settlement off the map. That would destroy dozens of innocent families, Caleb whispered, thinking of Pete Murphy, of the blacksmith with his 3 young children, of all the people who had built their lives here in good faith. Yes, Gray Eagle said, his face like carved stone. It would, but it would also stop Vernon Blackwell from turning our most sacred place into an open pit mine. The sun began to dip below the mountains, painting the sky in bloody shades of orange and red. The shadows stretched long and dark across the street. Caleb stood at a crossroads. He could let a monster win, or he could unleash a fire that would burn everyone, innocent and guilty alike. And he had less than 16 hours to decide. Caleb didn't sleep. He walked the empty, moonlit streets, the weight of his choice pressing down on him like a physical thing. Wreck the lives of his neighbors to stop Vernon, or let Vernon desecrate the dead. There was no clean path. Every option was soaked in loss. Just before dawn, Gray Eagle emerged from the shadows, as silent as the morning mist. "You have decided," he said. It wasn't a question. "I can't do it," Caleb said, his voice raw with exhaustion. "I can't use those treaties. There are too many good people here. Families who have worked this land just as hard as I have." Gray Eagle nodded slowly, a deep understanding in his eyes. "This is why my people chose to watch you. Another man would have taken that power and used it for his own revenge." "So we're finished," Caleb said, the despair absolute. "Vernon gets the valley, he wins." "Perhaps not." Gray Eagle's voice held a new, fragile note of possibility. "There is another way, but it is a path no white man has ever been asked to walk." Before he could explain, the thunder of hooves echoed from the end of Main Street. Vernon Blackwell appeared, riding at the head of a dozen armed men. They moved like an invading army, their rifles glinting in the first rays of sunlight. "Gentlemen," Vernon called out, his voice booming with triumph, "I trust you've made your peace with the changing of the guard." He swung down from his horse, dusting off his immaculate coat. "I have to admit, I'm impressed by your stubbornness. But the game is over." "The government sale isn't for another 3 hours," Caleb shot back. "Ah, a slight change of plans," Vernon said, pulling out a gold pocket watch. "I received a credible tip that certain disruptive elements might try to interfere with today's proceedings using fraudulent documents." He smirked at Gray Eagle. "So, I've invoked an emergency territorial provision to take possession of the properties immediately. It's called claim jumping, you understand. Can't have squatters getting in the way of progress." The trap had snapped shut. It was a lie, another legal trick, but it would work. He was daring them to fight, to give him an excuse to use the force he'd brought. "You can't do that," Caleb said weakly. "The territorial court will side with the man who can cancel their gambling debts." Vernon replied, his smile turning razor sharp. "The judge owes me a considerable sum. You see, Mr. Harrow, I don't just buy land, I buy people. Every angle is covered." He then turned his attention to Gray Eagle. "However, I am a merciful man. I will make you the same offer I made your cousins to the north. $500 for every family to relocate. No trouble, no fuss." "And our sacred burial grounds?" Gray Eagle asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Will be handled with the utmost respect during excavation," Vernon said breezily. "All remains will be carefully relocated to a more suitable plot outside the mining zone." "You would move the bones of our ancestors?" The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I would provide them with upgraded accommodations," Vernon corrected. "Honestly, it's a generous offer. Most operations would just plow right through." Gray Eagle looked at Caleb, his eyes filled with a century of betrayal and pain. "Now you see," he said softly. "Now you understand why my people have a different proposal for you." The words hung in the charged air. Vernon, for the first time, looked intrigued. "A proposal?" He laughed. "From a people with no land, no rights, and no future? By all means, entertain me." Gray Eagle ignored him, his focus entirely on Caleb. "For generations, my people have hidden in these hills, surviving on scraps. But we did not just survive. We learned. We learned your laws, your ways of business, your methods for holding power. Learned what? Caleb asked, his heart starting to pound. And we have accumulated resources, Gray Eagle said, his voice resonating with quiet pride. 27 years ago, while your prospectors were looking for gold, my people found a vein of pure silver in the northern mountains, a secret we have guarded with our lives. Vernon's condescending smile vanished. We have been mining it carefully, selling it through trusted channels in faraway cities. We have been building our strength in silence. He locked his gaze with Vernon's. We have enough wealth to purchase this entire valley. Twice. The revelation was so immense, Caleb could barely breathe. The Apache weren't destitute refugees. They were a hidden economic power. That's impossible, Vernon stammered. You have no legal right to own property. An individual Apache cannot own land, Gray Eagle agreed calmly, but a legally chartered corporation can. And a corporation can have a white man as its president, acting on behalf of silent, unseen partners. The world shifted on its axis. The entire audacious plan laid itself bare in Caleb's mind. You want me, Caleb whispered, to be the legal face of an Apache corporation. We offer you something no white man has ever been offered, Gray Eagle said, the weight of history in his voice. A true partnership, an equal partnership. You would hold the legal title, but we would govern the valley together, respecting the land, protecting the sacred grounds, and sharing the profits. But it requires absolute trust. One betrayal from you, and my people would lose everything forever. Vernon suddenly found his voice, a panicked, angry shout. This is insane. The government will never recognize. The government recognizes legally funded property transfers. Gray Eagle cut him off. And we have the funds to buy out every single deed in this valley, including the one you stole from Mr. Harrow. Vernon's face was a mask of fury and disbelief. He had been outmaneuvered at his own game. Then his eyes went cold. A touching story, he hissed, gesturing to his rifleman. But you're forgetting one small detail. Possession is 9/10 of the law, and I'm taking possession right now. His men raised their rifles. The metallic click of hammers being cocked echoed in the deadly quiet street. You have 1 minute to vacate my property, Vernon snarled. After that, you're trespassers, and I will deal with you. Gray Eagle looked at Caleb, his expression unreadable. Hope and despair mingled in his dark eyes. The choice was his, a partnership that could change history or surrender to a tyrant's greed. 50 seconds left to decide the fate of a nation. Caleb's gaze swept from the dozen rifles pointed at his heart to Gray Eagle's unwavering stare. The ticking of Vernon's pocket watch seemed to fill the world. 50 seconds. 49. 48. Vernon, Caleb said, his voice ringing with a sudden, unbreakable calm. You're making a very big mistake. Oh? Vernon's confidence was a brittle shell. And what might that be? You think this is a territorial dispute about property, Caleb said, pulling the fraudulent contract from his pocket and holding it up for all to see. But what it's really about is federal crime. Vernon's eyes narrowed. What nonsense are you babbling about? Mail fraud, Caleb said, the words sharp as bullets, using the territorial post to transmit falsified documents, interstate commerce violations when you arrange the sale of my cattle across state lines based on that fraudulent contract, conspiracy to defraud. With each word, Caleb grew stronger. When you stole my property using forged papers, you broke federal law. This is out of your pocket judge's hands now. You're bluffing, Vernon snapped, but a flicker of doubt crossed his face. Gray Eagle stepped forward, pulling a worn leather portfolio from under his poncho. 3 of my people witnessed your lawyer substitute the documents at the bank, he said in a clear, steady voice. They are prepared to deliver sworn testimony to the federal authorities. Vernon scoffed. Federal marshals don't give a damn about Indian testimony. They care about the theft of silver ore from federal land, Gray Eagle replied, his words landing like hammer blows, which is what your men have been doing for the last 6 months in the Northern Valley. Vernon's face went white. That's, that's a lie. You can't prove that. Can't we? Gray Eagle's voice was cold iron. We have photographs of your illegal mining operation. We have ore samples with geological markings that trace them directly to federal territory. We have copies of the bills of sale from smelting operations in 3 different states. He let the information sink in. My people have been documenting your crimes for a very, very long time. It all clicked into place for Caleb. Gray Eagle had known about Vernon's entire criminal enterprise from the very beginning. They hadn't just been watching Caleb, they had been vetting him. You needed someone with legal standing, Caleb realized aloud. Someone clean, who the feds would listen to when he filed the complaint. We needed an ally, Gray Eagle corrected gently. Someone who valued justice over profit. A nervous murmur went through Vernon's hired guns. They were thugs, not master criminals. Federal prison wasn't part of their pay. They began to look at Vernon not with loyalty, but with resentment. Lower your weapons, Vernon ordered, his voice a choked whisper. All of you. The rifles came down. Smart choice, Caleb said. He turned to Gray Eagle, his decision made, absolute and final. I accept your offer. Full partnership, equal terms, starting right now. You can't be serious, Vernon pleaded, his empire crumbling around him. A partnership with them? The territorial government will laugh you out of the capital. The territorial government just lost its jurisdiction, Gray Eagle stated flatly. Federal oversight takes precedence, and the federals are far more interested in cleaning up corruption than protecting local politics. As if on cue, a new sound of horses came from the East Road. Not a ragtag posse, but a disciplined column of riders. They wore the plain, functional uniforms of United States Marshals. The lead marshal, a man with a graying mustache and weary eyes, reined in his horse. We're looking for a Mr. Vernon Blackwell, he announced, his voice carrying the easy authority of the law. We have a federal warrant for his arrest. Charges include land fraud, interstate theft, and illegal mining on federal property. Vernon's shoulders slumped in utter defeat. How? The marshal shrugged. Anonymous tip came in over the telegraph 3 days ago. Came with a mountain of evidence to back it up. Gray Eagle caught Caleb's eye and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. They hadn't been waiting for Caleb to act. They had already set the wheels of justice in motion. They had just been waiting to see if he was the man they hoped he was. As the marshals slapped iron cuffs on Vernon Blackwell's wrists, Caleb felt the impossible weight finally lift. The battle was over, but the real work, the work of building something new from the ashes of the old, was just beginning. 6 months later, Caleb stood on the porch of a newly built office in the center of town. The sign above the door read, Harrow Apache Valley Partnership. It was a legal entity, a corporation, but it was also a promise. The morning sun lit up a valley reborn. Where there had been fear and suspicion, now there was collaboration. Apache families returned from a generation of exile, worked alongside the settlers, their combined knowledge creating a prosperity no one had thought possible. The creek, once choked with runoff, now ran crystal clear. Gray Eagle walked up the steps, his stride as confident as ever. The morning council is ready, he said. Inside the long meeting table was a picture of the new world they were building. Pete Murphy sat next to an Apache elder named Stone Speaker, animatedly discussing new methods for grain storage. The town school teacher was planning a curriculum with 2 young Apache men that would teach both histories, both cultures. First item on the agenda, Caleb announced, taking his seat at the head of the table. The mining proposal for the Eastern Ridge. The partnership's wealth, managed carefully, had transformed the valley. Limited, environmentally conscious mining operations, run with a mix of modern techniques and traditional respect for the land, funded schools, a doctor's office, and fair wages for everyone. The environmental survey is complete, reported the partnership's chief engineer. Zero impact on the watershed. We can proceed with the agreed-upon extraction limits. The vote to approve was unanimous. It usually was. Once people saw that cooperation benefited them more than conflict, the arguments became discussions, and the discussions led to solutions. After the meeting, Caleb walked through the town. New businesses were open, their shelves full. The Apache had shared their ancient knowledge of water management and dry farming, and crop yields had doubled. At the general store, Pete Murphy waved from his counter. "Afternoon, Mr. President," he called out. Caleb still wasn't used to the title. He was the president of an enterprise that now controlled more land and resources than many territorial governors, yet he owned none of it personally. He was a steward, not a king. "Any word from the capital?" Pete asked. "The governor is sending a delegation next month," Caleb replied. "They want to study our land management model. Seems other settlements are having a hard time, and they think we might have some answers." At the edge of town, Caleb paused by a simple hand-carved sign, Harrow Apache Valley Partnership, Yornur 1874, founded on trust, sustained by respect. And below it, in smaller letters, in memory of all who lost their way seeking only profit. Vernon Blackwell was serving a 20-year sentence in a federal prison. His corrupt network had been dismantled, his fraudulent claims voided. The man who had tried to own everything now owned nothing, not even his own time. Caleb's willingness to lose his ranch had, in the end, made him the guardian of an entire valley. As evening settled, casting a peaceful glow over the fields and homes, Caleb thought about the journey. He'd signed away his life's work for a single dollar. He had lost a piece of property, but gained a purpose. He'd surrendered his individual ownership, but had been given a shared responsibility for something magnificent. Gray Eagle had made him an offer no white man had ever received. Not for land, not for wealth, but for the chance to prove that two peoples, with a history of blood and mistrust, could build a future better than their past. Standing there, watching the lights come on in the houses of both settlers and Apache, Caleb knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had never been richer in his entire life. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale where courage and destiny collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super thanks to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.